Kid of Arcadia. Chapter 23. Gentle Glory. He wanted me to hate him. That was the first thing I remember thinking when I finally woke propped on the doorstep of my home the next morning in the chill. The sunrise had forced my eyes to open, and just like that the big dream was over. For the first time since I'd been uprooted, I loved where I'd been replanted. I was tucked in beside the front screen door, on the steps, and staring out at the early morning sky beyond the houses on the other side of the snowy street. My dad's old precious hatchback still sat in the driveway, and Mom's old rosebush still stuck up above the snow near the steps, just as I remembered those things. The snow hadn't buried that place that night, nor had it been swept away in a flood, as I would have wanted. It still existed even when I wasn't there. That was all I could think at a time like that. Waking up suddenly thrust back into that scene like all I had done had never even happened, as if I really could just return to it and everything would be all right. That very sick man couldn't stand the thought of having anyone too closely attached. He lived off our hatred and fear of him, but at least he kept his word. Forgive him? I asked, thinking of Gus. The icy wind that morning sure blew frigid, but he'd made sure I was properly bundled. His black toque was pulled down over my ears, and his worn leather jacket was buttoned up on top of my windbreaker with my hands in his gloves and tucked inside its sleeves. He'd given it to me, and eventually I even grew into it, at least now that a grown man wears it, and I still have it to this day. That morning my whole body was wrapped in the quilt from his bed, and I was no longer bound. All of this he did, and yet I don't remember him doing any of it for me. I sat puzzling until the cold forced me to make a decision, trying to sort out all the moves he had made that must have led to me sitting there. But then I gave it up. There was just no knowing what that man was thinking. My backpack sat open next to me on the front step, with all my clothes, my notebook, and the picture of Eliot tucked inside. At least I still had all the things I cared about. I was just too dizzy and freezing to move, with the lingering spirits of nausea floating around my head and gut from the night. The only thing I felt like doing was crying. Eliot, I thought. Maybe he's here. I knew my parents must have been still under investigation for my disappearance, so a good amount of anxiety suddenly boiled up over what I'd face if I rang that doorbell that instant, even just to get out of the cold. What if Eliot was back home and saw me? I didn't want anyone crying. I didn't want to face Mom and break her heart, just like I had done that night in the car before I was taken. I didn't want to face Dad, like it was the first time in years all over again. I didn't want to hurt anyone ever again. Tears now beaded up at the thought of merely stepping in that door, something I'd done countless times the year I lived there. I could see me go staggering in. They'd more than likely hold me there as long as they could, but I'd end up back in the system in no time. Eventually the authorities would find out where I was. I could see the whole chain of events following me simply ringing that doorbell, and how in no time they'd arrest my parents and have me back in the system, only this time without Josh or Gus to make it all right. I'd have to make all new friends just to see them get torn away all over again, and soon I'd be kicked out on my own, probably after they made me make up all the school I'd missed. My parents would be screwed and Eliot be taken from Dad yet again. That way was too heartbreaking. Through my frigid tears I glanced at the road across the snow and thought about getting up and running over to sit in the coffee shop down the street that always opened early. If I was lucky, I could then hitch somewhere far away once again. But where would I go? They'd find me eventually without a place to hide, shivering on the side of the road somewhere. Someone would take me to the authorities, only to find out that I had no home to go back to, and I'd be right back in their clutches all over again, only this time without Josh or Gus to make it all right. I'd have to make all new friends again, just to see them get torn away again, and then I'd be kicked out on my own. There was no escape there either. No matter what, I'll be back, I thought. I had to do the right thing. I turned my face away from the cold and tucked myself deeper down inside my windbreaker. If I was going to run away again, I wanted to leave a note to at least let my folks know that I was still alive and that I had been home, but I had nothing to write with. Perhaps I'd have to leave something behind, sitting on the steps in plain view to clue them in, or maybe just stick a single page of my dream journal in the door. They could follow my footprints, but I'd be gone. It seemed hopeless. No matter what I did, it didn't make a difference. The man had just dumped me back home because even he didn't know what to do with me anymore. Now I had to make that decision for him, for myself, for the first time. In the end, though, his house had been broken into, and now he had some sickos on him who could get him busted, if he hadn't killed them, that is. But he knew what he was getting into, and it was his own fault. We both had our own consequences to live with, I guess, just like anyone. When I finally stood, I wrote, "I'm sorry, Jared," in the snow by the door, and traced one of Dad's fish symbols next to it, so he'd know it was me. After that, I went on my way. At that time, I never said anything about what had happened to me, even once I was back in the system. It was just too recent and daunting to have to admit to. And then as the years passed, it became harder to. Eventually, I did try to track that man down, and even revisited the area to see what became of him, but I couldn't find his name in any newspaper or court case. Despite the fact that I still had his jacket, he only seemed to exist in my memory. Nobody by that name had ever owned that property, according to the records. And his business, too, was long gone with him. Nobody who might have known him could be reached. Then, as some more years passed, it became too late to do anything about him. But maybe that needs to change. The fact is, I know his name and I know where he lived. He done more damage than he knew in the short time he did exist, but as far as I know, none of his boys ever talked. Until now. I didn't want to do this, but I guess it's time for this man to be a man. I was still so young. I had so much more growing up to do, but the fact that I let him get away, just like all his other boys, is the reason I still feel sick. With this, I hope to remedy some of that, so that the world may know a little bit about what this man of myth and memory had done to us. That's also what hurts me the most, that despite my years of searching, I never found out what happened to Josh or Gus, or if they ever spoke out as well. I never knew their last names or anything more about them. Like so many kids, they too vanished into myth and memory. But I hope they see this, and I hope to see them again. I know Broder never got the chance to speak out about his own hurt to anyone but me, so let this be his testament too, as well as I remember it. We were all so young back then. In any case, I know it was all hopeless for that man, even if he never got caught, but like he said, it didn't have to be hopeless for me. Over the years I began thinking that he'd given me the first taste of real maturity I ever had, because as I grew older and moved into the world, truly on my own, I had that same feeling time and time again. I've only ever been free when nothing I did made any difference, and when I could just accept whatever was in store. I've always had my choices. That bright and cold morning I made my first one right there on that doorstep. And so once I'd driven the long way back there a few months ago, I just sped right past that house, that little house where we had been held captive all those months back in 1982, and didn't look back. And yet few things stay with you like a memory. They're like dreams that stick around, and they often make you feel sick of yourself, but having them is still better than forgetting. At the other end of it now, all I can say is I'm better off remembering the guilt and secrets that used to drag me down. I'm better off remembering how I cut them loose. So Kelly, you can consider this that book about my dreams you wanted me to write. It was a long time coming, and it took a lot of years before I could even get it all out of me like this, but here it is. It's my story, and it's the way I felt it should be told. Some names were changed, some not. Just know I've never stopped feeling sorry for what you went through. Shit happens sometimes. It often doesn't make sense, but it still happens. And the same to you, Eliot. I know we've come a long way, but you are my brother and I love you, and I've never stopped feeling sorry for how I treated you, and never will. But I know we all have our own lives to live, hurts to heal from, and choices to make. I know this because I was taught this when I first stood up in the front yard snow to leave you behind with Mom and Dad. That cold morning when I was 13, after I'd been gone for what seemed like a whole other lifetime, just to have a stranger take me home. December 3rd, 1982. The kid's gonna be all right. Thank God. The end.